We've talked a lot about Serbia during our regular episodes, from the war's beginnings and the repeated failures of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to conquer Serbia, to its invasion at the hands of the combined Central Powers, then to the exodus to Corfu, where the remnants of the Serbian Army were reconstituted to carry on the fight. And today, I'm not going to look at what they did, but what they wore. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Serbian uniforms in the First World War. Well, it's also about some of their uniforms from before the war. See, even though Serbia was officially independent after the 1878 Congress of Berlin, it had been fairly independent from the Ottoman Empire in reality since the 1830s, with its own ruler, constitution, parliament, and army. And there was a real desire to equip that army like a modern European one. And even to the end of the 19th century, you could see foreign influences at work on Serbian uniforms, depending on the current political situation. At first, the influence was strongly Russian, and in fact, the first uniforms were actually Russian uniforms, but with Serbian insignia. In the 1870s, you could see French-style kepis and German Pickelhaube simultaneously. However, it was at the beginning of that decade, in 1870, when the regulation of military clothing came out and the standard uniforms of both the officers and the enlisted men became more practical and appropriate for the modern battlefield. In 1896, a new pattern emerged, which was quite different from the Austrian-inspired 1870 pattern. It was clearly influenced by Russian uniforms and was a ploy by King Alexander to get more Russian support after his father's pro-Austrian policies. The men still wore the shaikacha on their heads, but the officers wore the shapka peaked cap. A new kalpak, a fur busby, was introduced for parade. The tunic was dark blue and single-breasted. Trousers were gray blue and the greatcoat dark blue. Collars and shoulder straps were in the colors of service. Now, this uniform was replaced in 1908, but is still important for World War I since Serbia could not produce enough modern uniforms for everyone. So the 1896 uniform was all over the battlefields of the Balkan Wars and this war. In fact, many reserve officers and second bond troops, soldiers 32 to 37 years old, you'll see wearing the old blues in pictures from back then. The soldiers' uniforms by now focused on simplicity and functionality, but not so those of the officers. The 1900 pattern officer's uniform introduced the mundir, a double-breasted tunic with 6 buttons in each row. It differed in color depending on branch of service, but eventually all regiments except cavalry wore black mundir. Cavalry wore light blue. Trousers were black except for the cavalry and general staff, who wore red with 2 black stripes. The 1908 olive green uniform pattern was a field service pattern for all ranks, to be worn on all duty occasions. The officer's tunic was made of wool and single-breasted with 8 hidden buttons and had 2 pockets on the chest and 2 down the sides. The upturned velvet collar showed the color of service. The summer tunic was the same cut, but made of linen or cotton and was white. The trousers and greatcoat were also the olive green. The coat was waistless and double-breasted with 6 buttons down each side. There were 2 pockets with flaps on the sides, and the left one was cut through for the saber. There was a long slit up the back for horseback that could be buttoned. Boots were black and came up just below the knee. The headgear was an olive green shaikacha. They had a leather belt with a holster for a handgun and a leather saber hanger. A saber, a map case, binoculars, and a case for them, and a canteen. The enlisted men had shaikacha, tunic, trousers, greatcoat, and boots. The shaikacha was olive green wool with no decoration. The flaps could be folded down in cold weather, and a piece of cloth could easily be attached to the back in the summer to protect the neck from the sun. The tunic was olive green wool with 7 hidden black bone buttons. It had 4 pockets, the 2 chest pockets with scalloped flaps. Earlier models had flaps on the lower pockets that could be snapped shut, but eventually they had the same as the chest pockets. Collar patches were the color of service, and shoulder straps were of the same material as the tunic, with 1 large bone button and the rank insignia on top. Soldiers that carried rifles had a roll on the right shoulder strap to keep the rifle sling from slipping off. Sergeants had the color of service piping on the shoulder straps. The trousers were olive green and were adjustable for high or low boots. The greatcoat was the same color, with the collar turned down with service color patches. When not in use, it could be rolled up like a bandolier over the shoulder. Tall boots with soft legs were used by the artillery and cavalry. The infantry got low black marching boots. There was, though, a chronic shortage of footwear, so many soldiers were issued with opantsi, traditional leather peasant shoes. They were cheap and easy to mass produce, and since most of the infantry were peasants, they were used to them. The infantry carried a belt with ammo pouches, 2 on the front holding 45 rounds each and 1 on the back holding 60. They had a water bottle and an entrenching tool, and a backpack was issued in smaller numbers. But most soldiers carried a plain white bread bag on its own strap. However, these uniforms were what the Serbian army used early in the war, before the retreat through the mountains of Albania and the regrouping on Corfu. Most of their uniforms were lost or destroyed during this time, and the new reconstituted Serbian army that fought the remainder of the war in the Balkans was equipped mostly by the French and wore their uniforms. Many officers, though, kept their 1908 patterns or had new ones made, so they were often wearing totally different uniforms from their men. 150,000 French Adrian helmets were issued, and they bore the Serbian crest on the front, and the kit the soldiers carried was basically French. Compared to the other nations, Serbian uniforms and gear were durable, simple, and practical. The olive green blended in pretty well with Serbian vegetation, and the relatively low weight was a great plus in the hills. There were a couple of downsides, like the ammo pouches were fairly bulky, but the real downside was that Serbia was not a wealthy nation and, especially after the 2 Balkan wars, could not afford to dress and equip all of its troops. So the first Ban, soldiers 21 to 31, had the 1908 uniforms. The second Ban, as I said, also had a bunch of the old 1896 dark blue uniforms, while the third Ban, ages 18 to 21 and 38 to 50, usually only got the greatcoat and the shaikacha, but sometimes wouldn't even get that. They might only have civilian clothes, and that gave Austro-Hungarian troops the excuse to shoot them or hang them as guerrillas and not regular soldiers. Much of the third Ban also had only 1 ammo pouch for their single-shot rifles. Nevertheless, it must be said that combat experience, resourcefulness, perseverance, and just the plain old will to fight made these Serbian peasants into some of the finer soldiers of the war. Thank you, Mihaljo Olujic, for helping us with the research for this episode. If you want to learn more about the Austro-Hungarian uniforms of the war, you can click right here for that. Do not forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.